In 1836, in the quiet countryside of Ohio, a family became the subject of one of the strangest and most disturbing cases ever whispered about in American history. They were not wealthy, not powerful, not even well known beyond their small community, and yet the events that unfolded within their household would linger for generations, baffling neighbors, terrifying the devout, and leaving men of science unwilling to commit their findings to paper. The family's name has been half buried by time, their story spoken more often in hushed tones than recorded in documents. What is remembered, however, is enough to chill the blood. Strange illnesses spread among them, but not like any illness their neighbors had ever seen. Children who should have been weak thrived under conditions no body should endure. Adults displayed behaviors so unnatural that even the local physician refused to offer an explanation. Visitors left the house shaken, and some never returned at all. To those who lived nearby, the family became something to be feared, something not quite right, something the human mind could not fully comprehend. What made the story most terrifying was not just the events themselves, but the silence that followed them. Doctors who examined the family spoke carefully, offering half answers as though they were frightened of the truth. Priests who were asked to intervene offered prayers but little else. And when outsiders pressed for details, the responses were vague, evasive, and always unfinished. Science, it seemed, would not, or could not, explain what had happened in that Ohio home. Nearly 2 centuries later, the mystery still lingers. Was the family cursed, victims of some undiscovered condition? Or were they something else entirely? Something that could not be written into the pages of medical history without changing what we believe about the natural order of the world? This is the story of 1836 Ohio, a family case so disturbing, so unexplainable, that science itself refused to touch it. You are listening to the Macabre Record. Before we begin unraveling this dark chapter of history, make sure you subscribe so you never miss another unsettling tale, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from. Ohio in 1836 was not the Ohio we know today. It was still a frontier in many ways, a land caught between the old wilderness and the creeping presence of settlements. Small towns dotted the countryside, linked by rough dirt roads and long stretches of farmland. Families lived in simple wooden houses or clay-walled cabins, their lives dictated by the seasons and the struggle to survive from one harvest to the next. The land was rich, but it was also isolating. Once the sun fell, darkness pressed in from the forests, silence broken only by the cries of animals and the whistle of the wind through trees. Life here demanded resilience. Men worked the soil until their hands bled, women tended to households that doubled as infirmaries, and children were expected to share in the labor from a young age. Neighbors helped one another when they could, but distances were wide, and communities often functioned as isolated worlds of their own. Rumors traveled slowly, carried by traders, preachers, or peddlers who passed from town to town. And when stories did arrive, they grew with each retelling, sprouting details like vines, until no one could say what was true and what was embellishment. But beneath the routines of farm and family life, the people of rural Ohio lived with a constant undercurrent of fear. Disease could sweep through without warning, leaving graves where laughter once had been. Fires could consume entire homes in minutes, and the wilderness itself was seen as a place of mystery, dense forests and hidden hollows where dangers lurked, and where, according to local folklore, spirits still wandered. It was in this world that the family of 1836 lived. Their home stood on the edge of a village that is little more than a name now, its place on the map faded or forgotten. They lived as others did, raising crops, keeping animals, and sending their children to the one-room schoolhouse when work allowed. To anyone passing through, they might have seemed ordinary, until the strange whispers began. For while most families struggled under the weight of hardship in predictable ways, this family's struggles were different. Their suffering was unnatural, their misfortunes tinged with something no one could quite name. And as the stories spread, their neighbors began to believe that this was no ordinary household at all. The family at the center of this tale did not arrive in Ohio with scandal attached to their name. By most accounts, they were like many others who had settled in the region, seeking stability in a land still half wild. They were of modest means, their home a simple structure built of timber and clay, with a slanted roof that sagged under the weight of snow in winter. The father was a stern, quiet man, remembered for his strength and for his tendency to keep his distance from the social life of the town. His wife was softer, more present in community gatherings, but even she seemed marked by a reserve that set her apart from other women. Together, they raised several children, all of whom would later become central to the whispers that spread. Had neighbors recalled that the family lived close to one another, seldom venturing beyond their farm unless necessity demanded it. Some said the father distrusted outsiders, others that he believed privacy was protection against misfortune. Yet this secrecy also bred curiosity, and in small communities, curiosity easily turned to suspicion. What little interaction they allowed revealed little. They paid their dues, attended church on occasion, and offered no public offense. The children, though, drew more attention. There was something peculiar in their manner, something that struck neighbors as uncanny even before the disturbances began. They were pale, despite long days in the sun, their eyes uncomfortably intense when they fixed upon others, and their laughter, when it came at all, had a brittle quality that left listeners unsettled. It was not that they were cruel or ill-behaved, but that they seemed somehow apart, as though their presence carried a weight too heavy for children to bear. Still, most dismissed these impressions as the quirks of a reserved family. Many in the village lived hard lives that left little room for pleasantries, and not every household encouraged chatter and friendliness. But when small oddities compounded, when the children appeared in places they should not have been, or when they lingered in silence, watching as though they were waiting for something, whispers began to grow. At first, these were small mutterings, easily ignored, but soon circumstances would arise that no one could ignore, forcing even the most skeptical neighbors to look upon the family with fear. The first signs of trouble did not come with thunder or spectacle. They began quietly, almost imperceptibly, until the weight of unease became too heavy to ignore. It was a neighbor's tale, passed to another over a fence, of hearing strange noises at night from the family's direction, low wails that did not sound like animals, nor the voices of ordinary men or women. At first, such reports were dismissed. In rural Ohio, night carried many sounds, and the imagination could easily turn the howl of a wolf or the cry of an owl into something unnatural. But then, more peculiarities began to surface. One farmer spoke of seeing the children in the fields long before dawn, standing motionless in the mist, their faces pale and unreadable. Another claimed to have passed their house late one evening, only to find every window lit, yet not a single figure moving within. The glow of lanterns in empty rooms became a common story, as though the house itself wished to remain awake long after its inhabitants should have slept. Soon, even the animals of the farm became part of the whispers. Livestock grew restless, refusing to enter their pens, and dogs that once barked fiercely at strangers now whimpered when they drew too close to the family's home. Horses balked at the edge of the property, and more than one visitor left in haste after describing the air as too heavy to breathe, as though some unseen presence pressed down upon them. Then came the illnesses, not the ordinary fevers and chills of rural life, but strange ailments that seemed to strike suddenly and vanish just as abruptly. A child would fall into convulsions, rigid and unresponsive, only to awaken hours later as though nothing had occurred. The mother was seen collapsing while carrying water, her body trembling violently, and yet she rose minutes later without injury or fatigue. These were not the patterns of sickness the community understood, and when the doctor was called, his remedies seemed to do little. By the time the year turned, the whispers had become fear. The family was no longer regarded as merely odd or private. They were spoken of as cursed, perhaps marked by something that no one dared name aloud. And yet, this was only the beginning. The disturbances would soon grow into something no neighbor could explain, and no man of science would dare record. Illness was no stranger to the farms and villages of Ohio. Fevers came with the change of seasons, chills swept through families, and life was often measured by how well one could endure the hardships of disease. But the sickness that plagued this family in 1836 was not like anything their neighbors, or even the local physician, had seen before. It began with the children. One would be struck down suddenly, falling to the floor as though seized by invisible hands. Their limbs stiffened, their jaws clenched, and their eyes rolled back until only the whites were visible. Neighbors who witnessed these attacks described them as unnatural, more violent than ordinary convulsions, and often accompanied by guttural sounds that seemed to come from deep within the chest. Yet just as suddenly as the seizures began, they would end. The child would rise, pale and dazed, but otherwise unharmed, often continuing their day as though nothing had occurred. The mother, too, began to show disturbing signs. She was seen stumbling in the fields, her body trembling uncontrollably, her mouth forming words that no one could understand. At times her skin grew deathly pale, her breathing shallow, convincing those nearby that she had died where she stood. But moments later, colour returned, breath resumed, and she carried on with her tasks as though nothing unusual had transpired. The father's affliction was different but no less troubling. He grew gaunt despite eating heartily, his eyes sunken, his frame shadowed by exhaustion that seemed to drain the life from him. Yet he continued to work, driven by a will that seemed both unnatural and unbreakable. His strength remained, but it carried with it a hollow quality, as though his body endured while something else inside him faltered. What struck the community most was the resilience of the family. These episodes, violent, terrifying, and unnatural, should have left scars, injuries, or at the very least weakness. But instead, the afflicted would return to their routines within hours. Children who had been rigid with seizures were later seen running through fields. The mother, pale and gasping one moment, was baking bread the next. The father, hollow-eyed and wan, continued to chop wood and till the soil. It was this resilience that disturbed the neighbors more than the illnesses themselves. It was as though the family did not obey the natural laws of sickness and recovery, as though their bodies were governed by something beyond ordinary flesh and blood. And if they could suffer without consequence, what else might they be capable of? Neighbors spoke of the family in tones reserved for the uncanny, as though even words might invite misfortune. In the taverns and at church gatherings, whispers spread like wildfire. One woman told of visiting the home to deliver bread, only to find the children sitting in silence around the table, their eyes fixed upon her in perfect unison, not blinking, not speaking. She placed the loaf down and left in haste, swearing never to cross their threshold again. Another account came from a farmer who claimed to have passed the family's field one autumn evening. The father was working alone, his figure bent against the fading light. But when the farmer looked closer, he saw the man lift a log so heavy it should have taken 2 men to move. He did not stagger nor pause, but carried it as easily as if it were kindling. The farmer swore he turned away immediately, afraid of what he had witnessed. Children in the village carried their own stories. They spoke of the strange way the family's children lingered at the edge of play, never laughing or joining in, but watching with an intensity that unsettled even the boldest of their peers. Some claimed the children knew things they should not, repeating phrases overheard in houses they had never entered, or describing events in the village before word had spread. Animals, too, seemed to sense something amiss. Dogs snarled when the family approached, then whimpered and slunk away. Horses grew restless when harnessed near their home. Livestock strayed from their fences, refusing to graze on the family's land. To neighbors who relied on the instincts of animals for warning and protection, this was perhaps the most chilling sign of all. Yet what bound these stories together was not proof but fear. No one could say for certain what was happening within the family's home, but every account carried with it a sense of dread, a conviction that something unnatural lay at the heart of their lives. The house itself became a symbol of unease, its windows, lit at odd hours, glowed like watchful eyes across the darkened fields. Its silence was too deep, its air too heavy. Even passing by on the road, travellers felt compelled to walk faster, to leave its shadow behind. It was in these whispered accounts that the legend of the family began to grow, not in documents or records, but in the uneasy testimonies of those who lived in their shadow. When the family's strangeness could no longer be ignored, neighbours began to search for explanations, hoping to anchor the uncanny in something they could understand. In 1836, Ohio, science and superstition lived side by side, and every attempt at reason seemed to collapse into something darker. The first to be consulted was the village physician, a man accustomed to treating fevers, injuries, and the occasional difficult childbirth. He was summoned after one of the children fell into violent convulsions that left the household in chaos. The doctor examined the boy, observed the rigidity of his limbs, the froth at his lips, and the hollow gaze that followed. His conclusion was vague. A nervous disorder, perhaps. But when pressed for remedies, he offered little more than tinctures and rest. When the boy recovered within hours, seemingly unaffected, the physician grew pale. He returned twice more for similar episodes, but his visits became shorter, his words more clipped, until at last he stopped coming altogether. Some said he refused to write his observations down, unwilling to affix his name to something he could not explain. The church was the next recourse. A minister visited the home after rumours of possession began to circulate. He prayed over the family, laid hands upon the children, and blessed the threshold with holy water. But his report afterward was troubling. He admitted that during prayer, the youngest daughter had repeated the words of Scripture with him, not in her own voice, but in a tone eerily identical to his own. He left shaken, muttering only that the family must remain vigilant in their faith. He too did not return. Neighbours, left to their own devices, clung to what explanations they could invent. Some claimed the land itself was cursed, tainted by old blood or forgotten rites of the native peoples who once lived there. Others whispered of witchcraft, suggesting the mother had brought something unnatural into the household. A few insisted it was nothing more than frailty or madness, twisted into spectacle by fearful eyes. Yet the family's persistence defied every explanation. They did not grow weaker, as sickness would demand. They did not seek aid, as the desperate surely would. Instead, they carried on, their lives marked by disturbances that no remedy, scientific, spiritual, or superstitious, could resolve. And then came the event that could no longer be excused as rumor or exaggeration, the moment when the disturbing truth of their case became undeniable. It happened in the late summer of 1836, when the air hung heavy with heat and the fields shimmered under a relentless sun. A neighbour, concerned after days without seeing the family, approached their home. What he found would become the centre of every retelling, the detail that transformed whispers into horror. The house was not empty, but neither was it alive with the usual clamour of a large household. Instead, he stepped into a silence so profound it seemed to press against his ears. In the main room, the family was gathered. Not seated, not working, but standing together in a strange tableau. The children stood in a line, rigid, their eyes unfocused. The mother was at the table, her hand resting on a loaf of bread half cut, the knife still embedded in the crust, as though time had stopped mid-motion. The father stood at the window, staring outward, unblinking, unmoving. The neighbour called out but received no reply. He stepped closer, his voice louder now, his heart pounding in his chest. It was only when he reached the centre of the room that the children turned their heads, not in unison, but one after another, as though some invisible hand guided their gaze. Their eyes fixed upon him, pale and empty, and for a moment he felt certain that he was no longer in the presence of ordinary people. Then, as suddenly as it began, the spell broke. The mother drew a sharp breath and resumed cutting the bread. The father shifted his weight, muttering something about the weather. The children blinked, their faces breaking into faint, brittle smiles. It was as though nothing unusual had occurred. And yet, the neighbor left the house trembling, his story spilling out in fragments to anyone who would listen. Others came forward with their own accounts, times they had entered the home only to find the family locked in moments of eerie stillness, as though the very air had frozen around them. These incidents became impossible to dismiss. Even the most skeptical neighbors admitted something unnatural was at work. When word spread, the family became more than a curiosity. They became an object of fear. People no longer spoke of odd illnesses or nervous disorders. They spoke instead of something darker, something that no doctor could heal and no minister could drive away. The family, it seemed, existed on the edge of two worlds, and neither one fully claimed them. As the stories spread, the weight of explanation shifted from doctors to ministers. In communities like rural Ohio, where science faltered, faith was often the last refuge. And yet, even faith seemed fragile in the face of the family's disturbing condition. The local congregation gathered in anxious whispers, urging their minister to take stronger action. What they feared was not illness, but something older, darker, a corruption of the soul that could only be explained as demonic influence. When the minister returned to the family's home, this time he did not go alone. He brought elders from the church, men and women who believed prayer and scripture could drive away whatever evil lingered in that house. They began with hymns, voices rising against the silence of the rooms. The family sat still, eyes lowered, but their stillness only deepened the unease. When scripture was read aloud, one of the children, no more than 8 years old, repeated the verses in perfect cadence, her voice shifting from childish softness to a tone that mirrored the elder's own. The congregation froze. The girl's lips moved in sync with the elder's reading, yet her eyes remained fixed on the floor, unblinking. The minister pressed forward, sprinkling holy water at the threshold and calling upon the family to renounce whatever spirit clung to them. For a moment, the mother seemed to waver. Witnesses said her hands trembled, and she whispered something inaudible. But before she could continue, the father's voice cut through the room, sharp and final. "We are as we were made. Leave us be." The words chilled those who heard them. Some claimed the father's tone was not his own, that another voice spoke through him, heavy and resonant, carrying an authority that silenced even the minister. Others said it was simple defiance, the pride of a man unwilling to submit. Whatever the truth, the effect was the same. The elders departed in fear, muttering that the family had closed themselves to salvation. From that moment forward, the church no longer sought to intervene. The congregation prayed for the family from a distance, but few dared approach their door again. And as faith retreated, fear only grew stronger. If even God's messengers could not pierce the darkness of that household, then what hope remained for the ordinary men and women who lived in its shadow? If faith could not conquer the strangeness of the family, then perhaps some argued science might succeed. But in 1836, science was little more than a collection of theories, fragile instruments, and the willingness of men to observe what others feared. And when science was brought into that Ohio household, it, too, recoiled. A physician from a nearby town, known for his progressive methods, was persuaded to examine the family after reports of their afflictions spread. He arrived with his satchel of tools and the confidence of a man accustomed to taming mystery with reason. At first he treated the matter with skepticism, expecting to find little more than exaggerations fueled by superstition. What he witnessed unsettled even his practiced composure. He recorded in his notes, later spoken of but never published, that the children's seizures did not conform to known medical patterns. Their bodies grew rigid in ways beyond natural convulsion, their skin flushing then paling, as though blood itself withdrew and returned by unseen command. The mother's fainting fits were equally inexplicable, leaving her seemingly lifeless before breath and colour returned without intervention. He observed the father's condition as well, describing a wasting of the body without the weakness such wasting should bring. Yet when pressed for conclusions, the physician faltered. His notes, it was said, were deliberately vague, filled with half-statements and ambiguous phrases. He returned to the family twice, then declined to visit again.
Now, rumors spread that he had been warned, by whom no one knew, or that he had seen something in the family's eyes that unsettled him beyond words. Another physician, this one from Columbus, was later invited to observe. He brought with him a fascination for unusual cases, eager to present his findings to medical peers. But within days of his visit, he too grew silent. He refused to discuss the family, save for a single statement to a colleague. "There are things the body can endure that the mind cannot." His papers contained no record of the case, as though he had erased it from his professional life entirely. This silence became its own explanation. When even men of science would not commit their observations to record, the mystery of the family only deepened. To the community, it appeared as though the doctors had glimpsed something they could not categorize without unraveling the very foundations of their craft. And so, science, like faith, turned its back on the family, leaving them to drift further into legend. For all the silence of doctors and ministers, the voices of ordinary witnesses filled the void. They were not polished, nor consistent, but their accounts carried the weight of lived fear. Each testimony was like a shard of glass, jagged, incomplete, yet sharp enough to cut. One farmer swore that while passing the family's home at dusk, he glimpsed a child staring from the upstairs window. Nothing unusual, save for the fact that the boy's reflection also seemed to appear in the glass, yet it did not move when the child did. He told the story twice before recanting, insisting he had imagined it, though his unease was plain. A woman who had once helped the mother with washing claimed she saw bruises on the children, dark rings around their arms and shoulders, though none complained of pain. She whispered that the marks looked less like injuries and more like impressions, as though unseen hands had gripped them. When pressed, she refused to elaborate further. Another tale came from a passing peddler who spent one night in the family's barn. He awoke to the sound of voices, not loud, but murmuring in unison. Believing it to be a prayer, he listened, only to realize the words were unfamiliar, not English, not Latin, but something harsher, rhythmic. He swore the children were among the speakers, their tones low and steady. At dawn, when he confronted the family, they denied that any gathering had taken place. There were contradictions too. Some insisted the family seemed almost too healthy, their children rarely falling ill despite strange fits. Others argued the opposite, that they wasted away before their very eyes, their bodies failing, while their presence somehow grew heavier. These conflicting accounts only muddied the truth, but they all shared one detail. No one left the family's presence without feeling changed, as though they carried something of that household away with them. It was this shared impression, the sense that the family's strangeness clung like smoke, that kept the testimonies alive. Whether exaggerated, misremembered, or invented, they painted a picture that no rational explanation could smooth away. And together, they built a legend that was not confined to the family's farm, but carried into every corner of the village. By then, the question was no longer if something strange haunted the family, but what? And worse still, how long before it spread beyond their walls? If there was a heart to the unease, it was the youngest child. While neighbors often spoke of the entire family as strange, it was the child who seemed to embody the deepest fear. Accounts differ on whether it was a boy or a girl. The details blur in retellings, but nearly every version agrees. There was something in the child's eyes that unsettled all who looked too long. Visitors described the child as too still, too watchful. Unlike others of that age, there was no restlessness, no playfulness. Instead, the child would sit silently, gaze fixed as though seeing something invisible to everyone else. On occasion, words slipped from the child's mouth that chilled listeners. A neighbor swore that while sitting near the hearth, the child recited the names of family members who would later fall ill. Another claimed the child spoke of a storm long before it arrived,
describing not only the thunder, but the trees it would tear down. Such foresight could be dismissed as coincidence if it were not repeated again and again. One story tells of the minister who tried to coax a prayer from the child, urging them to repeat words of blessing. Instead, the child whispered a phrase no one recognized. Some later said it was in Latin, others in a language unknown altogether. When asked what it meant, the child simply smiled, an expression not of joy, but of something older, something uncomfortably knowing. The parents, by most accounts, treated the child no differently than the others. Yet some neighbors noted how the mother's hands trembled when she touched the child's shoulder, or how the father's gaze faltered when the child spoke aloud. They did not scold or correct, only fell into silence, as though powerless against what their own blood had become. Whether the child was a vessel of foresight, a victim of illness, or merely a projection of frightened imaginations, the result was the same. The community's fear crystallized around that small figure. To them, the child was not simply odd. It was a living sign that something had crossed into their world, and if such strangeness could dwell in one child, it meant no household was safe. Fear moves faster than truth. Once whispers of the child's strangeness began to circulate, the entire family became marked. Where once they had been tolerated as peculiar, they were now regarded as dangerous. Neighbors who had once traded tools or shared meals began to keep their distance. Children who had once played along the same fields were called home at dusk, their mothers whispering warnings not to linger near the family's land. At church, the shift was unmistakable. The family's pew, once filled quietly though never warmly, grew emptier with each passing week. Some parishioners claimed they could not pray while the child's unblinking gaze lingered nearby. Others said hymns faltered on their lips when the family's voices joined, flat and toneless, as though sung by obligation rather than faith. The minister himself grew hesitant, his sermons bending subtly toward warnings of heresy, of families who turned from God and were punished in mysterious ways. Though he never named them outright, everyone understood the target of his words. Even daily routines became charged with suspicion. If crops failed near the family's property, tongues wagged that the soil had been cursed. When livestock sickened or wandered off, the blame inevitably curved back toward the strange household. One farmer claimed he saw the child standing at his fence line at dawn, staring silently at his herd. That same week, 2 of his cattle died without explanation. For him, no further proof was required. The isolation deepened, and with it, fear grew more irrational. Women carried sprigs of herbs when passing by the road near the family's farm, whispering protective prayers under their breath. Men avoided traveling alone in the evenings, glancing often toward the woods, half expecting to see pale faces watching from the trees. Even the sound of the wind near the family's home was said to carry unease, as though the very air resisted their presence. And yet, despite the fear, no one dared confront the family directly. There was talk, hushed but insistent, that to accuse them openly was to invite ruin. If the child could foretell death, if the house itself held strange power, then crossing them would bring consequences no one wished to bear. Silence became the community's only shield. Thus the family lived on, surrounded not by friends or neighbors, but by a circle of dread. Their land grew into a kind of invisible boundary, crossed only when necessary, avoided whenever possible. The family had not withdrawn from the community. The community had withdrawn from them. And in that withdrawal, the seed of something darker began to take root. Though few wished to step foot inside, there were occasions when necessity forced neighbors to enter the family's home, borrowing a tool, delivering a message, or assisting during illness. Those who did later spoke of a heaviness that clung to the air the moment they crossed the threshold, as though the walls themselves resisted intrusion. The house was ordinary in structure, timber walls, a clay hearth, modest furnishings. Yet visitors swore it felt wrong. Time seemed to stretch within its rooms. Minutes lingered like hours, and silence deepened until the crackle of the fire or the creak of the floorboards seemed unnaturally loud. Some said their own footsteps sounded delayed, echoing after they had already stopped moving. One woman claimed she entered to deliver bread, and upon leaving, found that the sun had shifted far further across the sky than she believed possible. More unsettling were the whispers. Several reported faint murmurs drifting from corners of empty rooms, too soft to understand yet too distinct to dismiss as wind or imagination. One man swore he heard his own name spoken from behind the doorframe, though no one stood there. Another recounted how the child's voice carried oddly, seeming to come from everywhere at once, bouncing unnaturally against the wooden beams. Objects, too, seemed unsettled. Tools misplaced themselves, chairs shifted slightly from their positions, and a Bible left open on a table was found closed the following morning, though the family insisted no one had touched it. To outsiders, these small oddities accumulated into proof. The strangeness did not belong solely to the family. It seeped into the home itself. It was said that animals refused to linger near the property. Dogs barked uneasily at the threshold before retreating, tails tucked low. Horses pulled away from the hitching post, eyes rolling as though at an unseen threat. Chickens and goats inside the yard appeared restless, constantly shifting, as if disturbed by something invisible. For the villagers, these stories confirmed what they already feared. The house was no longer just a shelter. It had become an extension of the family's strangeness, a place where natural order bent and ordinary rules faltered. To pass its threshold was to invite uncertainty, perhaps even danger. And so the family remained within their walls, cut off by fear from the outside world. But those same walls, instead of protecting them, seemed to twist the unease tighter, until no one could tell where the family ended and the house began. Fear eventually drives people to act, even when action is desperate. By the late months of 1836, the whispers about the family had grown too loud for the community to ignore. Some believed their salvation lay in prayer, others in medicine, and still others in the old ways, whispered through folk tradition. One by one, these attempts were made, and one by one, they faltered. The minister was the first to intervene formally. Summoned by anxious parishioners, he visited the family's home with Bible in hand. He urged them to kneel, to recite scripture, to renounce whatever darkness they might have allowed into their dwelling. But the prayers fell flat. Witnesses said the family repeated the words, yet their voices carried no conviction, hollow and lifeless, as though they were merely echoing sounds without meaning. The minister, pale and shaken, later confided to a deacon that when he looked into the child's eyes mid-prayer, it was like staring into a void that reflected nothing back. He left quickly, returning only once more before abandoning the effort altogether. The next attempt came from medicine. A doctor from a neighboring town, known for his boldness, arrived to examine the family. He checked their pulses, their eyes, their tongues, searching for signs of disease or fever. His notes, preserved only in fragments, mention no ordinary illness, only a melancholia beyond reason, an affliction of body and spirit he could not diagnose. He recommended tonics, purges, and isolation. None made a difference. Within weeks, he too ceased his visits, muttering that some maladies were not meant to be understood. Then came the folk remedies. Old women gathered herbs, binding them into bundles to hang above the family's doorway. Salt was scattered across thresholds. Protective charms were whispered over water drawn from the well. For a brief moment it seemed to some that the air lightened, that the house lost its oppressive weight. But soon the heaviness returned, stronger than before, as though mocking the efforts to repel it. Each failed attempt deepened the fear. The minister's prayers, the doctor's science, the villager's charms, all had crumbled before whatever dwelled within the family. The message became unmistakable. This was not a sickness that could be healed, nor a curse that could be lifted. It was something immovable, something that resisted both God and man. And so the family remained, untouched by cure, left to drift further into their silence. Around them the village grew colder, more suspicious. The failure of help only confirmed what many already feared, that this was not misfortune, it was doom. By winter's turn, the family's decline could no longer be ignored. Neighbors who passed their windows at dusk spoke of figures moving sluggishly inside, their shapes thin and frail against the glow of the hearth. Once the family had tended fields, repaired fences, traded at market. Now the land lay fallow, fences sagged, and no one saw them outside except in fleeting, unsettling glimpses. It was as if the family was slowly withdrawing from the world. The first death, or what was believed to be such, was whispered of in January. A traveller claimed he saw the mother carried out by the father and laid upon the ground, her face pale and still. Yet when the neighbours went to inquire, the father denied it, saying she was unwell but resting. No one pressed further, for fear of what might be found inside. Weeks later, others swore they saw the same woman again, moving sluggishly at the doorway. Whether alive or some shadow of herself, none could say. By February, the children were rarely glimpsed. When they did appear, it was from behind windows, their eyes watching with eerie stillness. One farmer's wife swore she saw the youngest child standing in the snow without shoes, expression unchanged despite the biting cold. By the time she returned with her husband, the child was gone, the prince leading only a few feet before vanishing into unbroken frost. Then came the silence. For several days, no smoke rose from the chimney, no sound carried from the home. At last, a group of men gathered courage to approach. They knocked. No answer. They pushed the door open. Nothing. Inside, the table was set with bowls and spoons, as though a meal had been interrupted. A pot sat cold upon the hearth. Beds were unmade, clothing left folded neatly. A cradle rocked faintly as if touched by a departing hand. But the family themselves were gone. Some whispered they had succumbed to illness, their bodies hidden away by fearful kin. Others insisted they had fled into the woods, following the strange child into the trees, never to return. A darker version claimed they had not left at all, that they remained within the walls, unseen but still present, listening to every intruder's breath. Whatever the truth, the family was never found. Their farm stood empty, a hollow place where life had once moved but no longer stirred. And in the absence of answers, the story grew, feeding on silence as surely as the house had once fed on fear. When word spread that the family's home stood empty, the community did not rejoice. Relief might have been expected, relief that the strange household had vanished, taking with it the unease that had shadowed the village for months. But instead, there was only a heavier dread, for absence solved nothing. The family was gone, yet their presence seemed to cling like smoke after a fire. Few dared to enter the house. Those who did came away shaken, swearing the rooms felt recently vacated, as though the family had just stepped out and would return at any moment. A blanket was still rumpled on the floor, a loaf of bread half sliced on the table, a child's toy resting in the corner. Everything suggested life had continued as normal until, suddenly, it hadn't. That uncanny impression, that time itself had been interrupted, haunted the men who saw it. They spoke little of what they found, and when pressed, they grew pale and evasive. Neighbors debated what to do with the property. Some argued it should be burned, reduced to ash, so that no trace of the strangeness remained. Others insisted burning it would only release whatever force lingered inside, allowing it to drift into their own homes. The minister counseled that the house should remain untouched, a warning left standing. And so it did, a hole. Low structure at the edge of the community, avoided by day, whispered about by night. For years afterward, villagers spoke of lights flickering in its windows long after it had been abandoned. Hunters claimed to hear laughter in the distance when passing the woods nearby, though no children lived there anymore. More than one farmer swore he saw a figure standing at the fence line at dawn, unmoving, watching, before dissolving into mist. The absence of the family did not erase the fear. They became, instead, a constant presence in rumor and imagination. Parents used the tale to warn children, "Do not wander, or you'll end up like them." Travelers were told of the cursed house where a family had disappeared, urged to pass it quickly and without looking inside. Silence became the community's defense. Records were not kept, names were not written, and when outsiders asked, villagers would shrug and change the subject. Yet the story lived on, as stories always do, carried quietly from hearth to hearth. The family was gone, but their shadow remained, stitched forever into the fabric of the land and the minds of those who endured their presence. With the house left standing but the family gone, the story began to slip from memory into legend. Each retelling shed some details and gained others, until what had once been an unsettling event became a cautionary tale whispered by firelight. For the next generation, the family was not simply remembered as strange neighbors. They became symbols, warnings, and omens. Parents told their children not to linger in the woods after sunset, invoking the vanished family as the reason. "Stay too long, and you'll be taken just like them." Travelers were warned against resting near the abandoned house, lest they too fall victim to its silence. Farmers whispered that to accept food or water from the family's land, even now, was to invite misfortune into one's home. The child, especially, became the centerpiece of the legend. In some tellings, it was the child who led the family into the woods, guiding them to a place they could never return from. In others, the child was left behind, still wandering the house at night, pale face glimpsed in windows, though no one lived inside. Still darker versions claimed the child was not theirs at all, but something left in their crib long ago, a changeling that hollowed the family from within. Over time, the story detached itself from names and dates. Few could remember the family's surname, fewer still knew the exact year. But that did not matter. What endured was the sense of unease, the outline of a tale that resisted explanation. The legend became malleable, shaped by each teller to fit the fears of their audience. Some emphasized the curse, others the sickness, still others the devil himself lurking within their walls. What remained constant, however, was the silence at its core. No matter the version, the family's fate was never fully explained. Did they die, vanish, or become something else entirely? That unanswered question gave the story its power. A mystery that resolves itself fades with time, but one that lingers unanswered only grows stronger. By the late 19th century, when Ohio had changed and grown, the story was still there, told in hushed tones. Children dared each other to touch the abandoned door. Travelers passed by quickly, eyes averted. And always, in every retelling, the lesson was clear. There are things science cannot explain, and families that vanish not because of what they did, but because of what they were. As the decades passed, the story of the Ohio family splintered into many forms, each shaped by the teller's imagination, fear, or memory. No two versions matched exactly, yet this lack of agreement did not weaken the tale. Instead, it made it stronger, for each contradiction left more room for the unknown, and the unknown is always more frightening than certainty. Some said the family had simply vanished. One evening, they were seen through the windows, gathered silently at their supper table, and by dawn, the house stood empty. No footprints, no struggle, only bowls half filled and chairs pushed back as though they had risen together and walked away into the night. In this version, the mystery was total. No deaths, no sickness, just erasure. Others swore the family had died inside, but their bodies were hidden away, either by fearful neighbors or by forces darker still. In those retellings, the house itself refused to give up its dead. Visitors entering swore the air smelled faintly of decay, though no remains were ever found. To these tellers, The family never truly left. They lingered within the walls, invisible but present, haunting their own home. Then came the tales of transformation. The child, always the focal point, was said to have led them into the woods where they became something other than human. Some spoke of pale figures glimpsed among the trees, watching silently with the same unsettling stillness as the family once had. Were these ghosts, spirits, or the family themselves in a new form? None agreed, but all insisted the forest still belonged to them. Even the family's name changed with the telling. Some gave them a surname that never existed in local records. Others omitted names altogether, making them less people and more archetypes. A father, a mother, children who defied explanation. These distortions mattered little to those who heard the story. If anything, the shifting details made the legend seem all the more real, as though it were too big, too strange to be contained by a single account. The contradictions allowed the tale to endure where certainty would have killed it. If their fate had been recorded, if their graves had been marked, the family would have slipped into history. But without answers, the silence became a canvas. Every teller painted their own fears upon it, and every listener carried those fears away. Thus, the Ohio family was never pinned down by fact. They became something more elusive, a story that thrived not in what was known, but in what was left unsaid. By the final decades of the 1800s, America was entering an age of record-keeping and inquiry. Folklorists, antiquarians, and amateur historians roamed the countryside, collecting the stories that had lived for generations only on the tongues of neighbors and kin. It was in this atmosphere that the tale of the Ohio family was first written down in earnest. What they found, however, was less a story than a puzzle, one that resisted all attempts at tidy explanation. Researchers who visited the region noted at once how easily the family's legend slipped from the mouths of locals. Old farmers and widows recounted the disappearance in hushed tones, their memories colored more by fear than fact. Yet when pressed for details, dates, names, exact locations, clarity dissolved. Some placed the events in 1836, others decades earlier. Some claimed the family were newcomers from the East, while others swore their kin had lived in Ohio for generations. Each testimony contradicted the last, but all agreed on one thing: the family had been touched by something no man could explain. When these folklorists turned to written records, church logs, county deeds, census rolls, they met only frustration. Names that should have appeared were missing. A homestead that locals swore had stood on a certain plot showed no trace in tax documents. A parish book, which by rights should have listed births and baptisms, jumped curiously over the very years in question. Whether these gaps were the result of clerical oversight, deliberate omission, or later tampering, no one could say. But the absence itself became fuel for suspicion. One antiquarian, writing in 1891, noted that where the family should stand in the record, there lies only silence. He suggested that either the community had willfully erased them, or that the family never existed at all outside of the fears of those who told the tale. Yet, paradoxically, the sheer persistence of the story argued otherwise. How could something purely invented endure with such consistency across generations? These contradictions fascinated collectors of folklore. They printed the tale in small journals and newsletters, not as verified history, but as a specimen of rural superstition. Readers across the country encountered the story for the first time in these pages, and though it lacked hard evidence, its very resistance to proof made it compelling. By the century's end, the Ohio family had been pulled halfway out of the oral shadows into print. But what emerged was no clearer than before, only a documented mystery, its gaps and silences preserved for posterity. As the new century dawned, the United States was changing. Cities grew, railroads connected distant regions, and the rural communities that once seemed isolated were now tied into a larger world. Yet with this spread of communication came an appetite for stories, strange tales that linked the modern nation back to its darker, older roots. The story of the Ohio family, once whispered only in farmhouses and at local gatherings, found new life in this expanding culture of print and performance. Pulp magazines, cheap and voracious in their hunger for the eerie, seized upon the tale. Between lurid accounts of haunted mansions and spectral hitchhikers, one could sometimes find a brief column about the vanishing family of Ohio. The writers rarely agreed on details, often embellishing the account with imagined horrors: a table still warm with food, a cradle rocking on its own, footprints leading into the forest that stopped abruptly mid-snow. These additions, though unverified, took on a life of their own, becoming accepted as fact in later retellings. Newspapers also played their part. Small-town presses, eager to fill columns, reprinted the story as both curiosity and cautionary piece. Some papers presented it as a historical mystery, others as a ghost story suited for Halloween editions. One Ohio newspaper in the 192s, Zeros ran a piece under the headline, "The House That Would Not Keep Its Family." Though written with journalistic flair, it leaned heavily on folklore, quoting unnamed old residents who recalled the strange silences of 1836. Meanwhile, traveling preachers and revivalists adopted the story as a tool in their sermons. They spoke of the family as an example of what happens when a household strays from God's light. Some went so far as to claim the family had consorted with darker forces, their fate a divine punishment. In tents pitched across Ohio and neighboring states, crowds listened with rapt attention, the tale woven seamlessly into lessons of sin, salvation, and the dangers of hidden wickedness. For audiences living in an era of rapid modernization, the family's story became a bridge to an older, more superstitious world. It was both entertainment and warning, a reminder that progress had not banished the uncanny. Whether encountered in a tattered magazine, a newspaper clipping, or a fiery sermon, the Ohio family remained alive in memory. Not as neighbors, not as kin, but as symbols of the inexplicable. By the 1930s, the story had drifted far from the dusty farmhouse where it began. It now belonged to the wider American imagination, reshaped with each telling, yet always retaining its chilling core. A family that vanished into silence, and a child whose gaze no one could endure. By the middle of the 20th century, the Ohio family's story had drifted into the margins of memory, a strange anecdote repeated in folklore circles, but fading from common knowledge. Yet in the decades after World War II, America entered a period of renewed fascination with the paranormal. UFO sightings, haunted houses, and ghost stories flooded popular culture. In this climate, the family's tale was pulled from obscurity and revived for a new generation. Paranormal books of the 1950s and 1960s, cheap paperbacks filled with mysteries of the unexplained, often included a brief retelling of the Ohio disappearance. The accounts varied wildly, but they carried a consistent fascination. The image of a household left as though abandoned mid-breath, food on the table, fire gone cold, no sign of struggle. These paperbacks, sold at bus stations and drugstores, spread the legend across the country, far from the farms of Ohio where it began. Radio programs devoted to strange phenomena also gave the story a stage. Listeners tuning in after dark could hear hushed voices recount the mystery, dramatized with eerie music and pauses heavy with implication. Some hosts speculated that the family had been the victims of alien abduction, an idea that would have been unthinkable in the 1830s, but which fit neatly into the anxieties of the Cold War era. Others suggested government experiments, secret cults, or curses tied to the land itself. The lack of answers allowed the story to bend to whatever fear most gripped the imagination of the times. By the 1970s and 80s, amateur ghost hunting groups had begun to emerge, armed with tape recorders, cameras, and a hunger for validation. More than one such group made its way to the supposed location of the family's house, though by then little remained but rumors and shifting landmarks. Some claimed to capture strange voices on their tapes, unintelligible, murmurs, cries, or even laughter. Others swore their photographs showed figures standing in windows where no building stood. These claims, unverifiable but compelling, breathed new life into the legend, just as it might have faded again. By the 1990s, the Ohio family's story had found a permanent niche within the growing culture of the unexplained. It was no longer just a local legend. It was part of a broader American fascination with mysteries that defied both science and faith. And though the world was modernizing rapidly, the family's silence remained untouched, as potent in rumor as it had been over a century before. The turn of the millennium brought with it something no ghost hunting club or pulp magazine could have imagined. A world where stories could travel instantly, crossing oceans in seconds. The Ohio family's tale, once confined to dusty farmhouses and the margins of folklore books, found a new life on the internet, and in that space, it flourished like never before. In the early 2000s, internet forums devoted to the paranormal became gathering places for strange tales, and the family's story surfaced again. Users posted fragments gleaned from old newspaper clippings or half-remembered campfire retellings, often asking the same question: had anyone else heard of the Ohio family who disappeared in 1836? Replies came quickly, some with additional details, others with contradictions, many with personal claims. A few insisted their grandparents had whispered the story to them in childhood. Others swore the house still stood, though its exact location shifted with every telling. Blogs followed, with writers fascinated by obscure mysteries publishing essays that pieced together scraps of evidence. They quoted folklorists from the 19th century, pulp magazines from the 20th, and oral histories collected in small Ohio towns. Photographs of abandoned farmhouses, sometimes unrelated, sometimes deliberately misattributed, circulated alongside these articles, giving the illusion of proof. The story, once fluid, began to calcify in the collective online imagination. Then came video platforms, where narrators with steady voices told the tale to thousands who listened in the dark. They spoke of the family as though it were fact, layering in eerie details from every era of retelling: the silent child, the rocking cradle, the abandoned meal. Millions of viewers encountered the legend for the first time this way, far removed from the Ohio soil where it began. Social media only expanded the reach. Brief summaries of the tale spread as viral posts. An entire family vanished in Ohio in 1836, food left on the table, no bodies ever found. Each retelling was simplified, sharpened, made more haunting by its brevity. And each share ensured the story traveled farther, reaching corners of the world where Ohio was nothing more than a word on a map. The internet did what the village never could. It immortalized the family. Once they had been neighbors, then rumors, then folklore. Now they were global, a permanent entry in the ever-growing archive of mysteries science cannot explain. With the legend of the Ohio family reaching wider audiences, it was inevitable that skeptics would follow. Folklorists, amateur historians, and skeptics groups began to pick apart the tale, determined to find the rational core behind the mystery. They argued that what endured for nearly 2 centuries was not supernatural, but the product of misremembered folklore, local hysteria, and embellishment over time. One line of argument placed the story firmly in the realm of sickness. In the 19th century, waves of cholera and scarlet fever swept through Ohio communities, often striking families suddenly and with horrifying speed. A household struck by such illness could vanish in weeks. Parents dead, children orphaned, records lost to overwhelmed parish clerks. To skeptics, the family's disappearance was nothing more than a misinterpreted epidemic, wrapped in the cloth of superstition. Others argued that the tale had grown from a simple act of abandonment. Families in the 1830s sometimes fled debts, crop failures, or social shame by leaving their farms in the night and starting anew elsewhere. The image of a half-sliced loaf and an unmade bed could be nothing more than the residue of a hurried departure, misremembered and dramatized by neighbors eager for a darker explanation. Still others insisted the family never existed at all. They suggested the story began as a morality tale crafted by preachers or parents, an allegory warning against pride, heresy, or hidden sin. Over generations, the fiction hardened into something resembling fact, until even the skeptical struggled to distinguish invention from memory. Yet for all their reasoning, skeptics never managed to erase the power of the tale. Their explanations, illness, abandonment, invention, were tidy, but they did not fit the jagged edges of the legend. They could not explain the contradictions that persisted across counties and generations. They could not explain why locals refused to walk past the ruins, or why multiple accounts across decades spoke of the same still-eyed child, the same oppressive silence, the same sense of something unnatural. And so the skeptics' work had the opposite effect. Their dismissals only sharpened the story, forcing believers and casual listeners alike to cling tighter to the mystery. For every explanation, a counterpoint lingered in the shadows. If science and reason could not account for the family's fate, then perhaps the legend itself was right all along. There are some disappearances that no explanation can reach. Nearly 2 centuries have passed since the Ohio family was last seen, yet their story has never faded. Instead, it has shifted form, adapting itself to each era that retells it. In the 1830s, it was a hushed warning whispered among neighbors. By the 19th century, it had become folklore, an oral shadow shaped by fear. In the 20th century, it was reimagined by pulp writers, revivalists, and paranormal investigators. And in the 21st, it thrives online, immortalized by screens that beam their mystery to the world. Why does it endure? Perhaps because the story resists closure. Unlike so many mysteries solved with the passage of time, the family's fate offers no single answer. Were they victims of disease, of abandonment, of superstition? Did they die quietly in their home, or vanish into the woods to become something unrecognizable? Or did they ever exist at all, their presence nothing more than a collective hallucination born of fear and rumor? Each possibility only fuels the imagination further. Another reason lies in the figure at the heart of it, the child. Always silent, always watching, the child's presence haunts the legend in every era. Whether imagined as a prophet, a changeling, or a cursed innocent, the child embodies the unease of the unknown. Children are meant to symbolize innocence, yet here the innocence is corrupted, inverted into something uncanny. In that inversion, listeners find themselves disturbed on a deeper level than the disappearance of a family alone could provoke. The house itself, too, plays a role in the endurance of the tale. It was not simply the backdrop of their lives, but an extension of the unease, a place where whispers lingered, where time stretched, where visitors swore they felt the weight of unseen eyes. When the house collapsed into ruin, or when it was said to vanish altogether, it only deepened the mystery. A family might be forgotten, but a haunted house endures in memory. At its heart, the Ohio family's story is not about proof. It is about what lingers when proof is absent. Communities carry scars in silence, and stories fill the voids left by unanswered questions. The family endures not because their fate is known, but because it isn't. That silence, uncharted, unbroken, is what makes the tale so chilling. Even now, when reason and science claim dominion, the story of a vanished family in Ohio whispers otherwise. That some shadows cannot be measured, some mysteries will never yield, and some absences will always speak louder than facts. Today, if you travel through rural Ohio, you will find no sign of the family's farm. The house, whether it collapsed under its own weight or was quietly taken down by neighbors, is long gone. Fields that once bore their footprints have been swallowed by woods, and roads have shifted so many times that even the location of their land is uncertain. The place itself has vanished, just as they did. And yet, the silence remains. Locals still speak of it, if you ask in the right way. They will not give you names or dates or maps, but they will lower their voices and tell you not to walk too close to certain groves, not to linger near forgotten clearings. They will tell you of dogs that refuse to enter certain patches of land, of hunters who return pale and shaken after hearing voices that should not have been there. Always the echoes circle back to the same story, a family that disappeared, and a child whose gaze no one could endure. The legend has become so entangled with the land that it is impossible to tell where truth ends and memory begins. Was there ever truly a family that science could not explain? Or is the tale itself the haunting, a curse of words passed down so long that it has taken on a life of its own? The line between history and folklore blurs until it no longer matters. What matters is the unease, the chill that creeps in when the story is told, the quiet that settles afterward, as if the listener half expects to see still figures standing at the edge of the woods. And that is why the Ohio family endures, not in records or monuments, but in silence. A silence that lingers when the story ends, that pulls at the imagination and refuses to let go. Silence that feels less like emptiness and more like presence. Watching, waiting, just beyond reach. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not what happened in 1836, but why the story still stirs us now. Why, across centuries, across countless retellings, the tale continues to unsettle. Perhaps it is because deep down we know the truth. Some absences can never be explained. Some vanishings are not meant to be solved. And so the family remains, not gone, not forgotten, but suspended forever in silence. And so we are left with silence, an echo of a family that may or may not have ever returned from it. The story of the Ohio family lingers not because it is solved, but because it never will be. What do you believe happened on that cold night in 1836? Was it illness, abandonment, something darker, or something that defies reason altogether? If this tale unsettled you, make sure to subscribe to the Macabre Record for more stories that the world has tried and failed to explain. And as always, tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what you believe became of the family.